Welcome back, everybody. If you're new, my name's Nicholas, and this is Investing Against the Grain. In today's episode, we are going to explain and talk through a few video clips that Sandy Munro had with the Tesla Plaid motor breakdown. So he essentially disassembled the Plaid motors and really broke down what they were, what's going on inside of them, what's different. The thing about someone like Sandy is that Sandy is a engineer's engineer, and so a lot of times when he speaks, he's talking to other people who may be up to par with everything he's saying. They already understand it. So my goal is to take all of that more technical jargon and try to distill it down to something that's more digestible for the everyday person who maybe isn't that familiar with mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, or anything related to motors in general. So the idea here is to simplify things and maybe give a little more context behind some things that Sandy is saying. All right, so that's the point of today's video. Before we get into today's video though, I want to talk about a couple things. So first, take a look at this. This was posted this morning. It looks like we officially have the first Giga Texas VIN number given out. So here we can see from Sawyer Merritt saying first Giga Texas VIN assigned to Model Y performance reservation holder with March delivery date. So this is pretty exciting. This looks like things are a go at Giga Texas. So it looks like Elon, Zach, and them are staying true to their word from the Q4 earnings call, talking about having Model Ys being delivered from Giga Texas by the end of Q1. So it looks like this is happening. Also, another big news. Take a look at this. More breaking news. Tesla full self-driving beta has officially launched in Canada. FSD beta request button will show up after installing the software update 2022.4.5.4. So pretty exciting here. So that's some pretty big news to happen on a Saturday. On a Saturday. So we got Giga Austin VIN number assigned to a customer, and we got FSD beta going live in Canada. So pretty exciting times here. All right, with the breaking news out of the way, let's discuss real quick how a Tesla vehicle works from the battery to the motors. And I think talking about this before we watch these clips will help give some context. All right, so first we need to have a little history lesson. For those of you who don't know, there's two different types of ways to pass electricity or to transport electricity. You have either DC or AC. DC is direct current, AC is alternating current. If I were to plot it on a graph, DC would be just a straight line going across direct current, right? Pretty straightforward. Whereas AC would be a sinusoidal waves. So if you're not sure what that looks like, it's just a wave, just going up and down, up and down. And if you could imagine, if you had like a axis like this, where the top is positive and the bottom is negative, this wave would just be going through the top, through the bottom, top and bottom. So that's a AC wave, alternating current. What you really need to understand about this is that there are two different people who invented either of these. DC, direct current, was actually created by Thomas Edison, or he's the one that discovered it, or he's the one who's at least attributed with the creation of DC. And alternating current was Nikola Tesla. So those are two things that we want to understand before we start explaining about what actually happened. When we look at a Tesla vehicle, the first thing that we all think of when we think of a electric vehicle, besides maybe the motors, is the battery. All right, so the battery is what houses all of the potential energy, the chemical energy that the vehicle has that will eventually be transferred into electrical energy, which will then be transferred to mechanical energy that then will get dispelled as heat. When we start with the batteries have all this energy inside of them. And in order to get that energy to the motors to be able to propel the vehicle, it needs to somehow go from the batteries to the motors, right? So how do we do that? Well, the batteries send the electrons via this DC format, this direct current, right? This is what Thomas Edison is, famous, for many things, but one of the things he's famous for. And so the Teslas actually leverage this. So the batteries essentially get direct current sent to what we call an inverter. All right, so the inverter is the first step that this power, this electricity is going to go through. So what's an inverter? Well, an inverter is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It inverts the actual current. So if direct current is just a straight line, what an inverter does is it takes a electrical current from going in a direct line and changes it into an alternating current. So AC current, that wave I was telling you about. So an inverter, really all it's doing is taking DC and transforming it into AC, alternating current. That's it. Okay, that's all it's doing. So whenever we go through this video and we're watching Sandy, now I'll remind you about this again, but the inverter is just changing from DC to AC. That's really all it's doing. We'll keep these things high level. From there, the inverter, it has to be attached to something, right? So it's attached to the actual motor, which is what, spins the tires and everything goes forward from there, right? This inverter is attached to a certain part of the motor, and this is what we call the stator, okay? In other words, think of the stator as the stationary part of the motor, the part that doesn't move. Now, within the stator, you have what we call the rotor, all right? In other words, the part that does move, all right? Pretty straightforward. Inverter attaches to the stator. The stator has inside of it the rotor, and the rotor will spin around. That rotor that spins around is attached to a gearbox, okay? And as that rotor spins around, it's attached to these gears, all right? And these gears are eventually what go ahead and move the vehicle forward or backwards, okay? That's the process. Battery sending DC to the inverter. Inverter changes that DC into alternating current, AC, right? The sinusoidal wave. The inverter is attached to the stator, the stationary part of the motor. And inside of the motor, we have the rotor. That rotor is connected to the gearbox. The gearbox sends all that electrical energy and transforms it into mechanical energy, which goes into the car tires. All right, so that's pretty high level, just kind of running you through that. Hopefully that made sense, but it'll make more sense as we go through this video. But I just want to touch on the high level first, because as we go through this, you'll be able to put my words and pictures together, and it'll make more sense when we talk about what Sandy's talking about, right? So now you'll have actual context about what these individual pieces are supposed to do.
This is one of the motors off the Tesla Model S Plaid. This is the inverter. Let's take this off. And let's look at this. This, like the sign says, is the Model 3 front. This is the Model Y front. This is the Model 3 rear. And this is the Model Y rear. Now, for those of you who aren't engineers, this is good engineering. This is forward and backward compatible.
So as I mentioned before, right, we go from the battery, and that's sending DC, and we go straight to the inverter. This piece is the inverter. This is what's taking that DC, that direct current, and converting it to AC, alternating current. Again, if we were to graph it from a straight line to a sinusoidal wave, where we're essentially going up into the positive, down to negative, back and forth, right? So this is changing essentially the polarity of the current, right? From north to south, south to north, north to south, and it's constantly changing. And what Sandy's talking about here, and it's funny because I've seen some people do reviews of Sandy and talking about this with the breakdown of the motors, and somebody talked about how the fact that everything's forwards and backward compatibles, it just reduces the amount of brain power it takes to design this, and it makes things so much simpler for them. I think that's a very big inaccuracy. To be able to build something, innovate, and still make it forwards and backwards compatible, that takes a lot of brain cycles. And in fact, if you look at all of these, you can see here, he talks about the Model Y rear, he talks about the Model 3 front, but with the Model S Plaid, it's actually going on the side. Again, to keep things the same so they can fit into previous generations and different models, and be able to be used on the Plaid, and be able to innovate, and we're moving it into a different location. That takes a lot of brain cycles. So this is a very big deal. I just call that out because sometimes something like this seems very trivial, and it really isn't. This is extremely difficult, right? This allows their engineering, their design to be timeless, Okay, and if you can have timeless design, it means you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, which is good. But in order to make something timeless like this, something that can be, preserved and held for years, it takes a lot of thought, and you have to constantly think about the past and the future. So don't think that this is just trivial. This is a bigger deal than what it seems.
The other ones will say Model 3 as well, because this is the standard that they have inside their organization. And because this board is so advanced, it's going to be around for a long time. All they have to do is modify some of these chips, but at the end of the day, this is a really good design.
Okay, so this is the other side of the inverter. So before he was putting them down, right, we could see the casing side, the aluminum side. So this is just him flipping the inverter around. Okay, so what we see here though with the inverter, there's a couple things I want to point out. One, the green board that you see there with all those little circuit pieces on it, that's called a PCB board, or a programmable control board. So you'll see these everywhere, okay? You'll find them on all kinds of devices, on your TV, you'll find it on your cell phone, on any motors, on your refrigerator, your oven, they're everywhere. Okay, PCB boards are extremely common. But here, what Sandy touches on is that, and Sandy's talked about this a lot of times, what Tesla has done just from, they developed their own PCB boards, by the way, right? You don't see a lot of companies do this, but Tesla designs them, and they've done it so well, and they've made such strides in their design and their efficiency and the way they lay everything out and what it's doing, how it's communicating, that they are, according to Sandy, 5 to 10 years ahead of everybody. Now, I've never taken it apart, and Sandy doesn't go into too much detail about what specifically makes it 5 years ahead of everyone else. Just take that with a grain of salt. What I will, in just a quick little DIY for all of you at home, if your TV ever goes out, for example, don't just think you have to go spend another few $1,000s on TV. Take a screwdriver, unscrew the back of your TV, pull it out, look at your TV's PCB board. The fastest way to figure out if there's anything wrong with it is just look for anything that looks burnt or black. All right, it could be a diode, a capacitor, it doesn't matter. You don't need to know what those words mean. All you need to know is how to use a screwdriver. And if you see anything on that board, this little green board that you see here, if you ever see anything burnt up, unscrew it, take it out. You know something's wrong with it. Look at the part number that's on that board. There'll be a certain part number, serial number. Type it into Amazon. You'll probably find the board. You'll get it back. It's like $30. You can put in your TV. You have a brand new TV. All right. So that's just a little DIY. Just all you have to know how to do is read a serial number and use a Phillips screwdriver. That's pretty much it. So don't ever be scared to do that. And it's really that easy to understand if there's something wrong with it or not. It'll be obvious. Something will be burnt. Something will be oozing out, maybe out of a capacitor or something. It's pretty straightforward.
So we have the rear motor assembly that's sitting at the front side of the table right now. They have 2 motors and 2 inverters that are all connected.
And while we're on here, I want to call out one other thing. So I had mentioned that we go from the battery to the inverter. Okay, well, somehow we're going to have to connect all these things, right? So we have to have some kind of bus bars, or essentially a medium where the battery cables connect to the inverter connects to the actual stator, the stationary part of the motor, which again, you'll see physically what that looks like in a second here. But that's what you see, these copper, like they look the color of a penny, right? These copper looking 3 tabs at the bottom here of the inverter. That's where they'll connect to, okay? It'll be 3 cables. The 3 cables indicate that it's a 3-phase motor. 3-phase is essentially just saying that we have 3 different currents that are going to be going at 120 degrees off cycle from each other. Why 120 degrees? Well, if you add 123 3 times, that gives you 360 degrees. So this offsetting is what allows the motor to be to actually be a 3-phase motor. It's what allows everything to keep spinning as far as the magnetic field. And I'll talk about that more in a second here.
Into one housing assembly. So when it gets mounted into the vehicle, it's going in as one unit. The gearbox housing has been integrated into the stator housing so that this is now one piece. They share a common gearbox housing on the inner side which allows them to make this a very compact unit.
This right here is a mirror finish. There are a lot of ways of making that happen, but the best way is something called roller burnishing, and that's what I think is going on here. Now this is where the bearings fit, and bearings have to have a very accurate and precise hole to be pushed into.
All right, they just said a lot of things there, right? So let me break this down. So he said that they have 2 motors, okay? So think of a motor for each tire, all right? So we have 2 motors. So just pretend these are the motors here, okay? And he's talking about how the housings are all incorporated together. So like we talked before, you have the motors, you have the inverters, and then you have a gearbox, and that gearbox can sit right in the middle. Okay, so the gearbox, it's what transforms the electrical energy into mechanical energy and allows us to be able to move with the vehicle. But so each vehicle or each tire is going to have its own motor. All right, so we have a motor, and that motor has what we called a stator before, right? The stator is the part of the motor that is stationary, but that stationary part has a housing to it. And so what they're saying here is the housing to the stator, the housing to that stationary part, plus the housing for the gearbox, plus the housing for the inverter are essentially all one piece that they're assembling together. So that's all they're saying here. They're just saying that all this is assembled together in a nice, easy package.
This roller burnishing is, if that's what it is, and I think it is, this is a fabulous way of putting bearings into a housing. This will give me a dead accurate diameter to shove those bearings in, and the bearings like it when they're pressed in, and they want to be just the right snugness in order to make this work.
Okay, so we're going to stop it there real quick. You can see here, think of it as 2 halves, okay? So as far as this housing goes, right? I talked about it being one clean package whenever they do the install. So in the first half, you have, say, for one side of the car, or one tire. So you have the motor, you're going to have the inverter, and you're going to have the gearbox. And then you're going to have the same thing on the other side. And then these 2 halves come together and get bolted together. So what you see here right now, this is the gearbox. This is half of the gearbox, and then they'll close together. And what Sandy's talking about right now about these, what they just look like round circles maybe to you, these aluminum, it's all made out of aluminum, but these round circles, this is where the bearings sit inside of. And when Sandy's talking about they want a tight fit, like that's a very understatement. Like when tight fit, like to the next level. In other words, a lot of times to fit bearings into their given racetracks that they have to sit inside of, people will either press them in with a hydraulic jack, or a lot of times what we used to do is we would just take these bearings, we'd put them in the freezer, let it sit there for about 12 hours, and then we come back, the bearing itself will have compressed, right, because of the coldness of the freezer. You drop it in, and then once it drops in and both the outside or the housing here and the bearing come to the same temperature, the bearing expands, and it's just this nice tight fit. And then you can spin that bearing and it'll just go for days. It's like the wheel of a skateboard, right? It'll just go all day. And so bearings have to be extremely, extremely tight fit. I mean, it's so tight, like to take it out, there's a special bearing tool that's like a claw that gets on the back of it, and you have to essentially have a wrench, and you screw down on it, and it slowly jacks the bearing out. So these are very, very tight fittings. But anyways, the point here is to understand that this is all still just the housing. Okay, so just to get you understanding what we're looking at, this is half of the housing. It's like as if we cut it down in half. What's it look like? This is what it looks like right here.
And it's really, really something. I really, really am impressed with this.
We're going to look where the inverter mounts into the housing next. So we have...
Okay, so before we get more into the inverter housing and all that, so do you see right here where it looks like that might be Sandy's hand? It's grabbing onto the middle of the inside that looks empty there. That's the stator. Okay, that's the stationary part of the motor. All right, that's the part that isn't going to be moving. All that does is create a electrical magnetic field. So we've talked about going from the battery, which has DC, to the inverter The inverter takes that DC current, makes it into alternating current, right? That sinusoidal wave. Okay, and so once we have that wave, what's happening is we are taking all of that energy, all the electrons from the battery, we're inverting it, and we're going to put it into the stator. So how does that happen? Well, if you remember those 3 copper leads from the inverter, right? So that's going to be attached to another 3 copper leads that are very similar, and those are attached to the stator. So the stator has 3 different phases, essentially. So they're offset through 120 degrees, like I mentioned before, but each one of these is going to create a electrical magnetic field. So anytime you run electrons through a wire, you create electrical magnetic field around it. Okay, so it's constantly doing this. So if I have a wire going here, right, you can't see it, but there's an electrical magnetic field going around it. With alternating current, what we can do is we can change the polarity of what's happening here. All right, so that's what we do here. And why do we use 3 phases? Well, we use 3 phases because if we had just one, okay, that could work, but we're not going to get as much power and speed out of that, right? If we could have 2, okay, that's better, because when one is going north-south, then the other one can push on it, and it's this constant push-pull. But what happens is eventually that could sync up, and these poles could get onto the same place, and then all of a sudden you're just stagnant. And so adding a third one, you have a constant rotation. All right, I'm explaining this at a very high level as far as how this works with the electromagnetic fields, but that's all you really need to understand. All right, this slide's 3 phases. It's offset by 120 degrees. Each one's creating its own electrical magnetic field. And again, this is something you can't see. But anytime you run electricity through a wire, you're creating that field. All right, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. And so what happens is whenever we put in the rotor, right, the rotationary rotary part of the motor, that's going to sit inside of here. And that magnetic field is going to push and pull on the magnets that are part of that rotary. So the rotor has these magnets all around it. And so that magnetic field that you can't see is going to be pushing and pulling on that rotor. Now, depending on which way you have your leads or the wires from each one of those phases, right, those 3 phases, I can change the direction of which way it goes. But so that's what's going to actually create that propelling effect of the motor to spin. There's nothing actually touching anything else, right? It's just a magnetic field that you can't see, and it's forcing this rotor to spin. It's pretty cool stuff.
This cast-in feature here, that is for the bleed resistor that is on the inverter. So that's a heat sink. So it's using some of the cooling that's inside the motor that's cooling the stator to help cool the inverter as well.
Just want to explain that real quick. A heat sink is essentially just a place where we can get rid of heat. Okay, so a lot of times these things get really hot, and we need to somehow get rid of this heat. And so that's all a heat sink is. It's a way for us to dissipate heat away from the actual motor, right? Because if it gets overheated, things are going to start to melt, things are going to start to short circuit, right? A lot of things can happen. So just want to explain that in case you didn't know what a heat sink was.
And then one other thing that they've done with this unit that Tesla hasn't done before is they are now side mounting their inverter. Which means you have the stator that's right here. Typically, they mount on the end of this on kind of a cap, but because of their width constraints, because they have 2 motors that are next to each other, they've had to move their inverter to the side.
Okay, so we've talked about the stator and the inverter now. So again, the inverter is going to, so that green board that we saw, right, that's going to sit right on top of this, and it's essentially going to be flush, and it will be bolted onto this. Again, the inverter takes the DC from the batteries, converts it into alternating current. And then the inverter, you can see down below, you can see those kind of, again, copperish looking wires coming out. That's essentially how it's going to tie into the stator, which again is the part of the motor that doesn't rotate. And you can see it right behind, right? We were just looking at it. So again, that's stationary. So far, everything we've seen so far doesn't move. All of this remains completely stationary. But you should have a pretty good concept now of what the stator is and what the inverter is and what it does. So again, the stator creates the electrical magnetic field, and the inverter takes your DC, makes it into AC.
And one of the penalties from that, you can see this piece here is still in, that is where the inverter will connect to this bus bar. And this bus bar, this is the other side, so it's not going to sit in here the same way, but this bus bar is going to go and connect to your stator. The leads that they have on their stator typically connect.
Okay, so take a look at that. He's got that bus bar, which is what's talking. Again, a bus bar, all it is, it's a copper strip that allows electricity to flow through. That's all it is. If you touch it, you go ow, or you scream, or depending on how high it is, you can turn to ash. But so this is what's going to connect essentially the stator, which you can see they have it here outside of the housing, right? They've got the stator there, and it's going to connect to the inverter. Now, you see how you can see like there's all these copper windings that you see there, right? Those are all part of those three phases. So you can see those three leads are sticking up where that bus bar is going to attach to. Those three leads are the three phases, okay? So that's what all those windings are. Those are the ones that are offset by 120 degrees, and those are the ones that each are going to create their own magnetic field. Right, so that's what's happening here. And again, it's hard to explain this because you can't see the magnetic field. You can see the wires, but you can't see what's actually happening, right? It's like wind. You can't see wind, but it's there. Radio waves, you can't see them, but they're there. This magnetic field, when electrons flow through a wire, that magnetic field gets created.
The one thing we also noticed was the gasketing. There's no RTV on anything for this product. All of them are laminated gaskets.
So this is something else that, again, most people won't talk about, but if you don't know what RTV is, it's like this silicone, you can consider like a gasket material. It's almost like an adhesive. It's red, smells like salt and vinegar chips. It's really the poor man or lazy man's gasket. It's quick, it's effective, but where it slows you down is you have to do any maintenance in order to use it again. You're gonna have to clean off the surface with like a wire wheel or something to make it all clean, and you reapply the RTV. And what Sandy has here is showing that they're not using any RTV. They're doing things the right way. They're using a real gasket with O-rings built into the gasket. So that's the right way to do it. It's a little more expensive, takes a little more time. But, you know, I think if you do it at scale, it's probably not that much more expensive, and it allows you for a better finish and a more high quality finish as well.
Okay, and then we're going to jump onto the stator to talk a little bit next. The stators that they're using are the same ones out of the Model Y. Again, Tesla has gone with reusing components everywhere that they can. So this is something that they're taking, they're already producing hundreds of thousands a year, and they're putting them into this vehicle. It's a coil wound stator, as you can see. It's a three-phase stator. They are, again, cooling through the channels in their laminates that are here. And they are using paper slot liners on the inside. Again, very similar, or the very same thing as the Model Y. So it's things we've seen before. And then they have a cooling ring that goes on top of this. So this is where the oil would be pumped through to go through the channels in here to help cool the stator. All right, and then this stator, when it goes to get pressed in, they heat press this into place. So they will cool the stator some. They'll heat up the aluminum housing so the aluminum grows. This will shrink a little bit, put it in place. Then when they go to the same temperature, it's a very tight fit. To be able to get these out, we have to cut the stator housing. So it's effectively held in place without any fasteners. It's not gonna go anywhere.
So this is very similar to what I was saying with the bearings. So I mentioned before with bearings, we would put them in freezers to cool them down, which would essentially shrink them because, you know, when things get cooled, the molecules end up, you know, getting closer, right? Take water. If you put water in a freezer, it turns into ice, right? Well, what's happening there? Well, the molecules are getting tighter. Well, same thing happens with any other matter, right? Especially with metals. Metals will get, you know, more compressed, and it'll get tighter, and it'll get smaller. And then you can drop the bearing in there, and they'll expand. And what he's talking about here is what they'll do with the stator, with the the internals of it, right? The windings and everything, is they'll pretty much keep that as is, but instead of they'll do the opposite. They'll take the housing and they'll heat up the housing. Well, if cooling makes things more compact and tighter, what happens when you heat something? Well, you're going to expand that. And so if I take the metal housing, I expand it, and then I drop the windings, the stator in there, well, when that housing comes back to normal temperature, right, it's going to shrink back in. And that shrink will make this fit together without having to use any fasteners or anything. So this is that's not a revolutionary thing by any means. That's done in normal engineering all day, every day. But it's one of the cool things about engineering is to see how some of these things come together and how you can influence things with just temperature, right, in order to make things fit and not having to use other parts. At least for me as an engineer, it's something that has always fascinated me.
Let's move over here to the rotor. And I think the first thing that I want to do is give you an idea of something that really surprised me.
Okay, before we see this, what have we talked about so far? We've talked about the battery cells, DC, right? Direct current. That gets turned into alternating current via the inverter. All right, that's that piece with the green board that gets mounted on the side of the actual entire assembly. All right, then we've talked about the stator. The stator is what we were just looking at there with all those windings, right? All those copper windings, right? That's the part that stays still. That has 3 leads that come off of it, right? All those windings are essentially just those 3 leads, okay? They're just winding over and over and over. Now, each one of those create the magnetic field. Okay, so why are we creating this magnetic field? Well, it's for the last part here, the rotor. Okay, so keep all that in mind. We're creating magnetic fields, right? But what are those magnetic fields doing? Well, they're just there spinning. Well, a magnetic field is no good without what? Magnets, because magnets get influenced by that magnetic field. So, with that said, let's learn about the rotor.
This is the rotor, and you can see that it's got a wrap on it. The wrap is made out of carbon fiber. And this is what we would call a winding. It is just a bobbin, basically, and it gets covered with carbon fiber and epoxy. It's a pre-preg, I'm sure. And when it's done, it's done. Now, that's something we've never seen before, and that's kind of amazing.
Not only has nobody ever seen this before, and it is amazing, but doing this out of carbon fiber, again, it's never been done before. And I don't know if any of you remember this, but to me, this was one of the biggest moments or biggest announcements made by Elon Musk during the Tesla Model S Plaid unveiling. I don't know if you guys remember that, but he talked about the motor. He talked about having the rotor carbon wrapped. This is that carbon wrap that he was talking about. Now, what announcement was so big? Was it the fact that they did this with the carbon fiber? No. What was a big deal is that Elon said in order to create this carbon fiber wrap, they had to create a tool, a machine to do this. One didn't exist. It's not like they could just go and say, hey, you're doing this, we want to implement that for what we want to do. No. Tesla had to completely make the tooling, the machine, in order to do this. All right, so when people talk about how, oh, well, Tesla has already done X, Y, Z, anyone else can just buy Tesla, strip it down, figure out what they're doing, and they can implement it. No, it doesn't work that way. Nobody has the machine to do this. Nobody knows how to do this. Nobody understands what went into this, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. And then let's say that somebody does do it at record speed. Say it takes a year, 2 years to figure out what Tesla's doing. Well, guess what? By then, Tesla's already iterated like 6 or 7 times beyond this. So whatever you try to do, you're so far behind. It took you a year or 2 to figure out how to do it. Now it's going to take you another year or 2 to implement it. And by then, you're about 4 years behind already. It's all about pace of innovation. Elon once said that he doesn't really worry about people stealing their technology or their patents or anything of the sort. And he said the best way to protect against intellectual property theft is to innovate faster. And so that's what Tesla does. This is perfect example of that.
But then we put the green paper on here, and that is not what I was expecting to see. If you remember before, I was telling you that all of the different laminates are slightly skewed. so that you don't get pulsing. This one is doing something magic. This is not skewed. This is inline, and I've driven that car quite a bit, and I detected no pulse whatsoever. I'm astounded, I guess would be the right word. I've never seen anything like this before on a high-speed, high-power motor. And I think it's because Tesla's invented some new physics or something.
So yeah, so Sandy's saying that he thinks Tesla's invented some new physics here. So what's he talking about? All right, so he put that green piece of paper on there, right? And that allows us to see where all those laminates are riding. And when he says that it's in line, what he's referring to is that normally what you'll see is you'll see all of these kind of staggered like this, and they'll keep staggering. And that essentially allows the vehicle to have a nice smooth ride. So there's no like, pulsing or jerkiness. And what he's saying is that he has never seen something like this with it being all in line, perfectly straight, as you can see here, right? You can see the straight lines. You don't need to know what it is. All you have to know is that you see it there. All right. And Sandy was talking about how in the Plaid, he drove it for, I don't know if I'm making this up. I think they did like 8,000 or 9,000 miles. Smooth ride, no pulsing, no jerking or anything. All right, so this is a pretty big deal, especially coming from someone like Sandy. All right, I mean, I'm an engineer, mechanical, electrical engineer is my background, but Sandy is somebody who's been in the automotive industry, working with motors and everything else, helped develop things. He's been an engineer for decades and decades and decades longer than I have, and he's sitting here looking at this saying Tesla created some new physics. He has no idea how they did this. He's completely baffled. All right, so just think about that. That's why it's so important for me to make these videos, is because when people invest in Tesla, and it's hard to get this across to people that Tesla is unparalleled. It's not like everybody else. Tesla's doing things different that you don't know about, that you can't see. Like it's reasons like this that you invest in the Tesla. It's for innovation. It's for the iteration. It's for the speed of it. It's for the fact that something has always been done a certain way, and Tesla's saying, nah, let's try something else. Let's do it a whole different way. Let's get back to first principles and work our way up. Why did we always do things that way? Well, what if we tried something else? That's why you're investing in Tesla, for those reasons. And unless Tesla loses that, then there's no reason for me to never be invested in the Tesla. But again, none of that is financial advice, just giving you my opinion.
The next thing that's kind of interesting is the laminates themselves. Now, I've never seen anything that looks like that. And these components here are a little different. You can see the magnets go in between here, and then you've got an end cap that holds it in place. Then you wind it with the carbon fiber. I've never seen anything like this before.
Again, Sandy's saying the same thing again. I've never seen anything like this before. Normally, those laminate pieces, at least the way I've seen them, are all square and they just slide right in. I obviously have never seen anything like that either.
And what we're looking at here is, here's your laminates on the shaft. Here's the magnets. By the way, these magnets were all glued together.
Okay, so the rotor. So let's get back to basics. We've talked about the batteries, DC, electrical current. All right, that goes to the inverter. Inverter does what? It changes DC into AC, right? That waveform. Okay. Now, once we've gotten to inverter, the inverter is attached to the stator, the part of the motor that doesn't rotate. It just stays there. But there's three phases, right? There's three phases, three leads that come from the inverter and attach to the stator. Now, each one of those are offset by 120 degrees, and they all are in this sinusoidal wave, and they're all creating their own electrical magnetic field. Okay, so now we talk about the rotor here. This is the rotor that we're seeing, and you can see where the magnets are. Now, that electrical field that we're talking about is going to impose its will on these magnets, and it's going to send these magnets rotating around, right? That's the inevitable push. So imagine, again, if I had a magnet right here on my finger, And imagine my finger, imagine this, I wish I had a diagram for this, but imagine this was the magnet, right? And imagine I stuck a bolt through my finger, okay? So now the magnet can spin, right? So if I flick this, it would spin, okay? So that's what we're thinking right now. Here's another magnet. This magnet's not gonna change. I'm gonna put it right next to it. Now, if this is the north side of the magnet and this is the south side of the magnet, and I put a north here and a south here, well, what's going to happen is the norths are going to want to, propel themselves away from each other. But this is on a spindle essentially. So the north here is going to be pushing this one. And it's going to push the north down. And as that north comes down, well, what happens? Well, south attracts the north, right? So the south side of it is going to want to attract this way. Okay, so I just did a 180 for that magnet. Now, can we keep that going? Well, you can. You add another phase. And then we add another phase, right? And so you can kind of understand what's happening here, right? And so that's what sends it round and round and round. And again, we can reverse the direction of this very easily. But that's essentially what's happening here. This is what the rotor is. These are the magnets. Now, as far as understanding how motors work, that's really all you need to know. That's pretty much it. You need to understand DC, direct current, and AC current. DC was Thomas Edison, AC, Nikola Tesla, okay? The inverter essentially is the bridge between Edison and Tesla, right? Taking what Edison did and turning it to what Tesla came up with. And then we have the stator. That's where we create the electrical magnetic fields. And then the rotor is what is impacted by those electrical magnetic fields, and that's what starts to spin around. Fun fact, by the way, these motors are called induction motors, which were also created by Nikola Tesla. So fun fact there.
All right, so we'll take another look at what Sandy was just looking at here with this rotor that we've partially put back together. So we have two magnets in here. We have our inner laminates that we've built in, and then we've got these bridges that go on the top. We're just gonna put this in so you can kind of see what it looks like when it's all together. Hopefully these stay kind of close to each other so we can show you what's here. And we'll pull the laminates apart a little bit. My tool gets stuck as well. But you can see that these are in here. They don't touch on the outside here, so they've removed that bridge that is on a normal laminate stack, and that has allowed them to get much better power and torque from this rotor. So they've patented this, and they're claiming in the patent that they're actually getting a 25% increase in peak torque and peak power because of building their laminate stack this way and using these pieces to remove the bridge that was here.
Now, this again is just why I keep saying this is why you invest in a Tesla. So luckily they have a patent on this, but they're talking about 25% more torque, I think is what he was just saying. And above my head as far as why that would create more torque, maybe because the bridge isn't connected, there's more of a centripetal force. I don't know. I'd have to do more research and really understand what I'm looking at there. But 25% more, just from a simple design change that Tesla's patented, right? These are things that you never hear about. These are things that don't come up on the quarterly earnings calls. This is the difference between Tesla and everybody else. Elon recently tweeted saying that they might make, 6 to 8 different changes in the design of a vehicle over the course of a couple days, right? New idea comes up, new design comes up that's better, that makes things better. They don't wait until the next year's model to implement it. No, they implement it then and there. So a vehicle that's produced at the beginning of a quarter and a vehicle that's produced at the end of the quarter might have 10 or 15 different changes in it because they've iterated. They've made things better.
Now we are going to hop back over to the inverter. And something that is new in this inverter, Sandy showed you kind of the highlights before, but there is now a explosive charge with a couple of plungers here that are used to break these bus bars. They have been shaped to allow them to break, and so that will break, this plunger will break the inner piece of the bus bar, and then there is a fuse that connects the outer part. So this fuse will pop once all the power is being ran through the outer portion. So this is a 3rd, 4th, 5th fail-safe that Tesla has installed to be able to cut power to the motors. 3, 2, 1.
Oh, that was a big nothing. Ah, you're kidding. I was hoping for a lot more than that. Oh, but you can see how this thing is blown out, and you can see it's basically broken the, which is probably a good idea, because I don't want to have a lot of stuff ruined on the circuit board. If there was some kind of accident or something, I guess I'd want to be able to identify what's gone right and wrong, at least maybe on that board. So this is kind of a cool idea.
So I think that was pretty straightforward. It's pretty much just a plunger fuse, if you will. So as I guess the amperage exceeds, I mean, they didn't really talk about it, but as it exceeds, it sends these plungers out to the side and it breaks those bus bars. So it's essentially yet another way to disconnect power from the motors. So very interesting demonstration there. That was pretty cool. And Sandy's right. You want it to work for the purposes intended. So to disconnect any potential power to the motors, but you don't want to ruin the entire board, right? So you don't want to have something that's for safety, but also ruin the entire board, because then you need another board and that costs more money. Whereas you could just replace these little plastic pieces and fix the bus bar. So pretty cool idea there. But again, just the Tesla way, always thinking about safety and how can we be better about safety.
Put it in the loop and we pulled it off. So this would have came out at 140 newtons of force. So we did this 10 times for each of the magnets. We used the BMW i3. We chose that one because that was the first electric vehicle, the motor that we have in-house, so it's the oldest one that we have. We used a Tesla Model Y. We also did the Mach-E rear motor as well as the Model S. And as you can see, the Model S does have the strongest force to pull this bolt off of the magnet. And that's just what we mean by this is a strong magnet. It's just a very anecdotal test as we get anecdotal feelings. We do send all of these magnets out to get their Gauss ratings, and that is available in our motor reports.
Okay, so that's pretty much it. That's all I really want to cover today. So you can see strong magnet from Tesla. The Model S is stronger than everyone else, and then Model Y is number 2 there. Again, just something else that differentiates Tesla once again. So hopefully this video explained a little bit better about how these induction motors work and what the process is. Again, it's not something you have to really know a lot about, but I do think it's important, especially for us transitioning to a world of electric vehicles. It's important for you to know some basic concepts. Something like what's direct current versus alternating current. And again, just knowing little things like Thomas Edison created DC, Tesla created AC. And what's the difference between them? Well, on a graph, it's, straight line for direct current, AC is alternating. And then how do we go from DC to AC? Well, that's where the inverter comes in. Okay, so the inverter is just essentially taking from one form of electricity to another, so from DC to AC. And then what? Well, we need to get that into the stator, right? And the stator is the fixed part of the motor that is going to create these electrical magnetic currents, right? So these currents that essentially just go in a circle, that electrical magnetic field. And again, this happens no matter what. If you run electricity through a copper wire, it's going to create a electrical field around it, right? Whether you can see it or not. And so then that's where you put in the rotor. The rotor has magnets on it. Depending on which way you have your 3 phases, which way you have them, you can change the direction of that rotor. That rotor is then connected to a gearbox. And so as that turns, these gears also start to turn. And from there, you can pretty much understand how that essentially goes out into your car tires. Now, what's cool about using an induction motor, and just something yet again that makes Tesla or electric vehicles better than internal combustion engines, is that there's this concept of regenerative braking. So you've probably heard that. Maybe you don't know what it really means. You've heard people say that, well, it can make your brake pads last longer. Well, sort of. It doesn't make your brake pads last longer. It makes you use your brake pads less. That's the real difference. So what happens? Well, whenever you're sitting there stepping on the accelerator, all you're doing is sending electrons to the motor to go forward, right? So you're going in the forward direction. Now, when you let off, Well, what's happening? Well, the vehicle is still moving forward. Okay, in basic physics principle, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. So energy can only be transferred. Now, normally with, say, an internal combustion engine car, that energy that's going forward when you want to come to a stop is transferred onto your brake pads, which are essentially just going to compress, and those discs are going to slow down, and that energy gets transferred into heat that gets lost into the atmosphere. Okay, well, what if we could do something better than that? What if we could preserve that energy? Well, that's where regenerative braking comes in. So as you let off of the accelerator, well, you are no longer sending all these electrons to the motor. So what happens? Well, you have a reversed effect where we can take that kinetic energy and we can essentially go backwards with the motor, turning it into a generator. Okay, so we're taking that kinetic energy and we're essentially using that to use the motor as a generator, and that can essentially preserve your battery life or work its way backwards to, charge up your battery. So pretty cool how that can work. That's a little more complicated about how that could work, especially with the inverter, AC, DC, all that, but you get the idea. Pretty cool stuff. I hope this helped you out. I hope you understand a little more about how these motor works, about induction motors, maybe about the history. Maybe when you watch Sandy go through this next time and he talks about a stator or an inverter or a rotor, you have a better idea of what these components do and what their purposes are. And if that at all came across and you understand a little more, then you know what, this episode was worth it for me. All right, we're gonna leave it there. Do me a favor, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, ring that bell. I love you all. Peace.